In your Gifford lecture, Science and Christian Belief, you posed an important distinction between top-down and bottom-up thinking, suggesting your preference for the latter in scientific and theological inquiry. What in particular do you feel that bottom-up thinking has to offer us in both these fields?
Well, bottom-up thinking seeks to move from experience to understanding, as opposed to top-down thinking, which believes it starts with clear and certain general principles and then can condescend to particulars. And I think that bottom-up thinking is very important in science, in theology, and indeed in many other forms of human inquiry, because reality is often very surprising and strange, beyond our powers to anticipate. We don't have clear and certain ideas at the start, which are going to tell us exactly what form reason is going to take. Taking an example from science, I worked in particle physics. The quantum world is quite different from the world of every day. In the quantum world, if you know where something is, you know what it's doing. If you know what it's doing, you don't know where it is. In the quantum world, light can behave sometimes like a wave, which means spread out and flapping, and sometimes like a particle, which means a little bullet. Now, anyone in 1899 could have proved that was impossible. I mean, you had to be one or the other.
Yes.
And in fact, of course, that's how light behaves, and after 25 years of struggle, the physicists came to understand that. So we have to allow reality to shape our thinking. If that's true of the physical world, it's surely even more likely to be true of the infinite mystery of God. So I think that the bottom-up thinking is very important to theology as well. And for a second reason, which is that the new atheists, in their polemical way, are continually asserting that religious people believe either without evidence or even against the evidence, that we are somehow committing intellectual suicide. And by showing the motivations we have for our beliefs in a bottom-up way, I think we can refute that foolish caricature.
So it's a kind of induction that goes back to the idea of science as induction.
Yes, it's the idea that, as I say, the particulars are the guide to general thinking rather than the other way around.
And it's a stance of humility in the face of the complexity of the world and the infinite mystery of God.
Well, yes, exactly. I mean, reality is not ours to manipulate or to specify. It is for us to learn from it what its character is.
And do you think that science at the moment is going in that bottom-up direction, or perhaps with theories of everything is moving in more top-down
Well,
way?
there is some speculative thinking. String theory is an example.
Yes.
The string theorists believe they can tell us, they're very clever people, they believe they can tell us how nature behaves 16 orders of magnitude. That means 1 followed by 16 zeros, smaller than anything in which we have direct experience. I think that's probably over-ambitious.
Yes. And so what have been the major developments in your field, whether expected or unexpected, since you gave your lectures? Have these led you to change or nuance in your position in any way?
Well, I think one of the things that's happened is that the science of religion discourse has begun to engage more seriously with central theological understanding and central theological issues. I mean, its classical form was in terms of what you might call natural theology, looking at the order of the world and the fruitfulness of the world and saying, doesn't this suggest a divine mind and purpose behind it? And I think that's valuable and helpful, but it's a very thin slice of experience. And its picture of God is not really very much more than the great mathematician or the cosmic architect. It doesn't answer a question like, does God act in the world in specific ways? Does God care for individual people? But in the last few years, the thinking has engaged very much more with theological ideas, with questions of providence. Can we really believe that God acts in the world in particular ways? With Trinitarian thinking, the relationality goes with that. And also with what people call eschatology, which means the end of things, how things end, not only how they begin. And that has been very fruitful and helpful and necessary, I think, for the discourse between science and religion.
And that relates to your mode of bottom-up thinking as well?
Well, absolutely. I think so. That's right. I mean, let's take the question of providence, for example. One of the big discoveries of 20th century science was that the physical world is not mechanical. The world that Newton describes looked like a piece of gigantic clockwork, and God could only be the sort of cosmic clockmaker. But in fact, we found in the 20th century that the world is stranger than that, that there are unpredictabilities at present in nature, intrinsic unpredictabilities that can't be removed by calculating more exactly or experimenting more precisely. Found that first of all in quantum theory, and then later on in the middle of the century in a slightly different way with chaos theory, everyday physics in a way. And that tells us that the world is something more subtle and subtle than mere mechanism. And another interesting conclusion we reach from that is that physics by itself doesn't settle the causal structure of the world. It constrains it, of course. But, for example, take quantum theory again. Quantum theory is unquestionably statistical. It deals with probabilities. Is that because of ignorance of all the factors that actually bring about what's happening? Or is it due to the fact that there's an intrinsic indeterminacy in nature? Niels Bohr said one thing, a very clever chap called David Bohm said the other. Their two interpretations produce exactly the same experimental consequences. So the choice between them can't be decided by science. It has to be decided by what you might call meta-science, by philosophical considerations that go beyond it. So it's perfectly possible to believe that the grain of nature is an open grain. I think that it's very persuasive to us because I think we have the experience of actually a degree of free will, of being just able to decide to raise our hand or not as we wish. And if we're able to act within the open grain of nature in that sort of way, it would be very surprising if the world's creator was not also able to act providentially. So I think from that sort of analysis, which took a lot of effort in our community in the 1990s, we can see how we can take science absolutely seriously, as we certainly need to do, but without believing that God is just an impotent spectator of cosmic history.
Yes, so you've mentioned divine agency and providence, as well as quantum physics and chaos theory. And I know that much of your work has been in developing theories of divine agency.
Yes.
How does that link into quantum physics and chaos theory?
Well, quantum physics, of course, is one example of this unpredictability present in nature. I think I was actually myself more influenced by the unpredictability of chaos theory, because chaos theory operates at the everyday world of direct experience, which affects us more directly. Well, of course, quantum theory is down at the sort of subatomic roots of the world, and it's not quite so clear how that affects us directly in a providential way. But whichever line you took, I mean, these are, I think, just models, thought experiments, if you like, to see how one might understand human agency and also divine providential agency. I mean, undoubtedly, the acts of agents are more complex than any single level of analysis is going to reveal. But it encourages us not to give up, not to believe things that seem to me unbelievable, really.
Yes, and so this openness of the universe reflects on our experience of free will and consciousness as well.
I think it's related to that. Absolutely, I think that's and I think that's a very basic experience. If we were just automata, that doesn't only destroy free will, it also, I think, destroys rationality. I mean, my utterances are just sort of automatic quackings away.
Yes. Yes, and so this openness, although in your Gifford lectures you distance your views from process theology, in recent years you've been one of the leading advocates of the, as you're saying, the open grain of the universe and the kenotic account of divine agency. Right. What do you see as lacking in classical theism in this regard?
Well, it seems to me that Christian theology faces a dilemma about how to think of God's relationship to creation. There are two extremes, neither of which it seems to me is acceptable. One is the picture of deism, where God is just sets it all spinning, sits back to watch what happens. He's the sort of spectator of the world. And the other extreme, of course, is the God who is, so to speak, the cosmic tyrant, whose creation is a sort of puppet theatre, and God controls absolutely everything, causes everything to happen. Now, neither of those things, I think, can be true for Christian theology, because the essence of Christian theology is to believe that the nature of God is love. The gift of love is always the gift of an appropriate form of independence to the objects of love. I mean, as parents, we know that we have to allow our children to grow up, to be themselves, and to make themselves. And I think that God, therefore, allows creatures to be themselves, indeed to make themselves. In fact, that's a way of thinking about how an evolutionary process in the world. And I think the world of that kind, of that open kind, is if I may venture to say so, a greater creation than a ready-made or automatic world would have been.
And so does this openness and this indeterminacy set limits on God in any way? Well,
I would say that God respects those limits. I mean, I don't think God is limited from the outside. That's my big difference with the process thing. The process people think that God has to be limited and can only act through persuasion in the world. I don't think that's right. I think God has full powers to do whatever God wishes to do. But God will only do what is in accordance with God's nature. To say God's almighty doesn't mean that the rational God can decree that 2 + 2 = 5. It means that God's actions are consistent with his nature. And therefore I think that God does allow creatures to be themselves and to make themselves, but that is a voluntary restriction of love, self-restriction of love on God's part, and not imposed from outside.
So it's an intrinsic self. It's a limitation that God chooses voluntarily. It's not intrinsic. It's not something he's forced.
Yes,
to.
I mean, obviously, the classical theologians like Aquinas and so on wanted to insist that God is not constrained by creatures. I mean, that's the mistake of idolatry in various ways, to think that. But I think they didn't realize that God's love might consist of a gift to creatures to be themselves and make themselves.
And one of the key themes of kenotic theology as well has been the suffering universe, the suffering of God, and the links with evolution. What are your comments on that?
Yes, indeed. I mean, I think the greatest problem that religious belief faces is the problem of evil and suffering in the world. We all know what the problem is. If God is both good and powerful, how does it come about that there are murderers, how there are earthquakes, things of that nature? And again, we have to go back to this question of what we mean by the almightiness of God. God is not a cosmic tyrant. And if you're going to allow creatures to make themselves, that means to explore and bring to birth, through the contingencies of what happens in the world, the fruitfulness with which creation has been endowed. And that will be a greatly fruitful process. In fact, it's turned a ball of energy into the home of you and me in 13.7 billion years. But it's going to have ragged edges and blind alleys. I mean, just take an example from evolution, biological evolution. The engine which has driven biological evolution, that amazingly fruitful history of over 3.5 billion years, which turned a world of bacteria into a world with human beings in it, that's possible and driven by, of course, genetic mutation. Germ cells mutate and produce new forms of life, which can then be sifted and preserved through the processes of natural selection. But if that's going to be possible to happen, it's inevitable that somatic cells, body cells, will also be able to mutate genetically. And sometimes when they do that, they will become malignant. So it's obviously an anguishing fact that there is cancer in the world, but it's not gratuitous. It's not something that a God who is a little bit more it's not something that a God who is a little bit more careful or a little bit less callous could easily have eliminated. You see, we tend to think if we'd been in charge of creation, we would have done it better. We would have kept all the nice things, the sunsets and the flowers, got rid of all the nasty things, the disease and disaster. The more science helps us to understand how the world works, we see it's a sort of package deal. Genetic mutation, new life, genetic mutation, malignancy. You can't have one without the other. And though I don't think that removes all our perplexity, or indeed our anguish and anger about that suffering in the world, I think it's mildly helpful. So ironically, evolutionary understanding, which is sometimes thought of as being the big clashing point between science and religion, is in fact very helpful to religious people in their search for truth.
Yes, and so would you, the traditional narrative has been in terms of a fall and linking disease and death to fall from grace. Would you challenge that in any way?
Yes, I think that's become unacceptable for us. Yes, I mean, Augustine and people like that felt that the creation was marred through the original sin of Adam, and that death came into the world through that. But obviously, death was in the world millions and millions of years before there were any human beings. I mean, it was 65 million years ago the extinction of the dinosaurs gave the furry mammals who are our ancestors their evolutionary opportunity. What came into the world with the dawning of human beings, I think, is first of all self-consciousness. We have a power not only of being aware of things, I think the higher primates certainly have that too, but we have the amazing ability to cast our minds far into the future and far into the past. I don't think even the chimpanzees possess that. They live in the near present. They can figure out, throw up the stick, maybe the banana falls down. They don't sit there thinking in 15 years I'm going to be dead. We do. When self-consciousness came into the world, at the same time, I think, human beings became God-conscious in the way that the animals aren't. And not a single disastrous ancestral event, but a disastrous process, I think, happened that our ancestors turned away from God and into themselves. That didn't bring death into the world in a biological sense, but it brought into the world what you might call mortality. Because our ancestors held self-consciousness, they knew they were going to die, because they had alienated themselves from the God who is the only ground, I think, of the hope of a destiny beyond death, that realization became bitter to them. So mortality came into the world in that sort of way.
So mortality is distinct from biological death?
Yes, that's right.
Spiritual death?
Yes, or spiritual, yes, spiritual anguish and so on.
Spiritual anguish.
Yes, and I think, you know, if you look at if you look at St. Paul saying that death came into the world through one man, he wasn't obviously thinking of evolutionary biology. No, that would be an absurd thing to say. But I think that what he was really getting at, the heart of the matter, is consistent with what I just said.
And this idea of consciousness as a distinctive between humans and animals.
Self-consciousness.
Self-consciousness.
Yes.
Are we gesturing towards the soul and towards a kind of dualistic idea?
No, I think we have very good reason to believe that we are psychosomatic unities, as people say. We're a sort of package deal. Of course, we have a physical aspect and we have a mental aspect and spiritual aspect, but the two are held in some sort of complementarity. They're not separable bits. Here's one bit, here's the other bit. That's more that science tells us about how our brains work, how brain damage affects human personality and so on. Makes it increasingly difficult to think that we're ghosts in the machine,
yeah.
in that kind of way. And interestingly, of course, that's exactly how the ancient Hebrews thought about human beings. They thought of them as animated bodies rather than incarnated souls. So the human soul is not a detachable spiritual component that might be released at death. We're not apprentice angels in that sense. But the human soul is presumably the real me, and actually it's almost as hard to understand what that is in this life as it might be beyond it. You see, here am I, ancient, bald academic. What makes me the same as the schoolboy with the shock of black hair and the school photograph of 18 years ago? You might think material continuity, but that's actually an illusion, because the atoms in my body are changing all the time. I have very few atoms in my body that were even a few years ago, let alone. So I'm atomically distinct from that schoolboy. What is the continuity is something like, and here I have to wave my hands because I don't know how to say it properly, is the almost infinitely complex information-bearing pattern that at any particular time the atoms of my body carry. That means my memories, my character, and so on and so on. That's the soul. So I think we have to reconceive the soul in that sense. Now, of course, when I die and my body decays, that pattern will decay with my body, but it's perfectly credible, I think, to believe, and I do believe, that the faithful God will not allow the pattern to be lost. God will hold that in the divine memory, preserve it in the divine memory. That's not preserving me, because I think to be truly human, I have to be re-embodied. I have to have a body as well. And that's why the Christian hope has never been sort of spiritual survival, but it has been death and then resurrection. So, I mean, that's a very quick account of a very deep and profound issue, but I think I can, again, hold my scientific understanding with integrity together with my Christian beliefs and Christian hopes.
Yes. So going on to this idea of the Christian hope, some of your own recent work has been in the field of eschatology, which is the question of last things, but many people feel that the scientific scenarios, such as the Big Freeze or the Big Crunch, are incompatible with this Christian hope. What would you say to that? Well,
I would say to them, of course, every story that science tells, in the end, ends in decay and dissolution. That's, if you like, that's the second law of thermodynamics, which says that unless you interfere with systems, they always get more and more disorderly. And the reason for that is simply that there are many, many more ways of being disorderly than orderly. So in the end, the waters of chaos rise and so on. So every story that science tells ends in futility. But of course, science only has one story to tell, which is, if you like, the horizontal story, the unfolding of present physical process. And that will end. You know, our death will end eventually in the death of the universe. It becomes more and more dilute, and more cold, and more life disappears from it. But as a religious believer, I believe there is a second story to tell, a vertical story of God's faithfulness. So I think we do have a hope of destiny beyond death, not a natural hope that science could either speak for or against, but a theological hope based on the faithfulness of God. And of course, as a Christian, I believe that actually exemplified within history by the resurrection of Christ as the forerunner of our own destiny beyond history.
So there's a breaking in of God's purpose and plan seen in Christ and seen in the second coming.
I mean, breaking in not in the sense of a sort of interference, in the sense of saying, oops, today I made a terrible mistake, but the unfolding fulfillment of God's purposes. I think God's creative purposes are intrinsically two-step. First of all, God brings into being a world of creatures who have to exist at some distance from their Creator. Otherwise, they will be finite beings who will be just overwhelmed by the unveiled infinite reality of God. So we live at a distance from our Creator in this present world. It's a world of becoming, a world of death, and so on. But God's final purpose is to turn the old creation, as St. Paul would call it, into a new world, the new creation. And I believe that has already begun to happen. I think the seed event for that is the resurrection of Christ. That's incidentally why the tomb was empty. The Lord's dead body was transformed into the glorified body of this new creation, a world which isn't subject to the thermodynamic drift to decay, but a world of everlasting life. And that seems to me, again, mysterious, of course, but it seems to me perfectly credible. I can, again, take such scientific insights as I have perfectly, properly, seriously, without feeling I have to deny that possibility.
So God reverses the second law in some ways.
Well, he
institutes a new order.
If you're going to have a world in which creatures make themselves, then you have to have a world with death in it, because the new life of the next generation is purchased by the death of the present generation. So this world has to have that sort of character, but that doesn't mean to say that creation has to have that character absolutely forever. God's purpose is, as I say, two-step. And so this world is certainly important because it is the raw material. The new creation doesn't come into being by God sweeping aside the old creation, scrubbing the slate and saying, I'll start again and try and do better the second time. It is the transformation, the redemption, if you like, of the old creation into the new creation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Polkinghorne, for offering us a view of bottom-up thinking and the openness of creation.
Thank you.